Okay, thank you very kindly for that introduction. That was very nice of you. Um, I am, as was said, a person with albinism. I probably just look like an old guy to you, which I am officially because I got a Medicare card recently. Um, I've experienced albinism and have been involved in albinism leadership for a long time. Um, I live in Chicago, and I have a grown son, and my wife and I have lived in Chicago our whole lives. What I want to do today is to do two or kind of three things. I want to talk a little bit about albinism first, and then I want to talk a little bit about the Global Albinism Alliance, and then talk about potential partnerships or collaboration with Massé World. If that meets with everybody's approval, I'm going to jump right in. So, what is albinism? These are a couple of cute little guys. This picture was taken at a NOAA conference, and they are uh, typical oculocutaneous albinism. And I probably looked a lot like that when I was about 60 years younger. Albinism is something that occurs throughout nature. So, a lot of times you hear the term albino, and it often refers to animals. And here are some representation of some very cute animals. That's what we're not going to talk about today. We're going to talk about albinism in humans. So in humans, albinism is an inherited genetic condition that reduces melanin pigment that forms in the skin, hair, and or eyes. So one of the misconceptions about people with albinism is that they have red eyes or pink eyes. And as you can see in this slide, that they're the upper left hand, they kind of sort of look red. The issue is that there's reduced pigment in the iris of the eye, and light shining into the eye can often produce a red eye effect, just like you would see in a photograph of a person with average pigment. So one of the things that one of the myths that we need to bust is that in order for you to be an albino, you have to have red eyes. And just a quick word about terminology. While the term albino is scientifically correct, it's generally not preferred within the community because we prefer to put the person first. And as I said a second ago, albinism, the lack of pigment can occur in the skin, hair, and eyes. In some instances, there's a type of albinism where the reduced pigmentation is only present in the eyes, and that's referred to as ocular albinism. So albinism occurs in all racial and ethnic groups throughout the world. This is not the greatest set of pictures that I have, but it does represent. You can see people literally from all over the world. And unlike those two cutie pies that I showed you at the beginning, you can notice in this particular picture a range in pigmentation. So a person with albinism doesn't necessarily have to have the platinum white hair like I do. As you can see in the picture, there is a range of the way that that albinism can present itself. And the numbers about the prevalence of albinism are kind of shaky. Approximately 1 in 17 or 18,000 people have some type of albinism in the United States. But what we've learned through some scientific studies and some things that have been going on around the world, that the occurrence of albinism varies from place to place in the world. And for example, Israel, because it has a unified medical system, a researcher there was able to determine that the occurrence of albinism in Israel is about 1 in 6,750. There are countries in Africa where it has been observed that the occurrence is as high as 1 in 1,500. So through all the years that I've worked representing albinism communities, and whenever I've done an interview with a reporter or a student or whatever, one of the first questions is, how many people in the world have albinism? And the truthful answer is that we really don't know. So there are approximately 20 or so genes that cause albinism. About 7 or 8 of them cause oculocutaneous albinism, which is a type of albinism I have, which affects the skin, hair, and eyes. There's one gene that, 1 or 2 genes that result in the ocular albinism that I referenced a minute ago. And then there are syndromic forms of albinism. There's, I don't think, about 10 or 12 genes that cause Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome. And what the syndromic forms of albinism are the person presents with albinism, but they have additional metabolic disorders. In the case of Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome, there's platelet dysfunction that results not in every single patient, but depending upon the type of HPS that they can have an inflammatory bowel disease similar to Crohn's. They can have pulmonary fibrosis, and they also can have bleeding disorders. In Chidiac-Agashi syndrome, in addition to the oculocutaneous albinism, there's an immune deficiency which increases in a great susceptibility to infection, and people with it manifests itself obviously from birth, and this affects children with albinism, and they have a significantly reduced quality of life because of their susceptibility to infection. So, okay, why isn't it not? Why is it not? Okay, so there are 2 issues that I want to talk about with respect to albinism. And the first is low vision, and the second is stigma of difference. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the low vision first, and it's a little scientific, so I'm going to go, I'm not a scientist, I'm going to do it at a high level and go kind of fast. So low vision and albinism, here's some cuter pictures of people that we've managed to accumulate over the years. So low vision and albinism is manifested by nystagmus, which is an involuntary eye movement. So it looks like a person with albinism is looking everywhere all the time. The doctors and the scientists are not 100% sure what causes the nystagmus, but it is one of the characteristics that you'll see in a person with albinism and with respect to their low vision. A person with albinism also experiences photophobia, which is light sensitivity. So because of the reduced pigment in the retina and the iris, which I talked about the iris a little bit, a little bit ago, I'm going to talk about the retina in a minute. Basically what that creates is kind of a stage light effect. So people with albinism, to varying degrees, have difficulty in bright light. And people with albinism also have reduced depth perception, which I'm going to explain a little bit more in the next couple of slides, along with the fact that people with albinism have some degree of uncorrectable low vision. So with respect to the depth perception, have you ever thought about the fact that you have 2 eyes, but your brain only sees 1 image? The reason for that is that the optic nerve, which is connected from the retina, from the back of the eye, on each eye, transmits signals to the midbrain or the chiasm, and then there is a crossover of the reception from each eye. And in a pigmented person, as you can see by the slide, the uncrossed and crossed are roughly even, but in a a person with albinism, the cross fibers are much different. So your brain actually processes vision in the brainstem. So the scientists aren't exactly sure why this is, but the effect is that we have a lower depth perception. So it's not that we see the world in two dimensions, but it's harder for us to track moving objects. And this would be a fun party game for you if you're really bored someday. A way to simulate this is if you cover one eye and you find a partner and they cover one eye, and you take something like a tennis ball or something that isn't going to hurt you or whatever you're around and try to play catch with it, you're going to find that your depth perception is reduced by the fact that you cover one eye. So moving on, as I said, the issues with vision in people with albinism, reduced vision with albinism, is really focused on the back of the eye as opposed to the front of the eye. When I say to people that I have vision of 2200 or 2300, they say, oh, well, without my glasses, my vision is 2200. Well, the difference is that in an average eye, you can correct the changes in the shape of the lens or the shape of the eye with spectacles or with contact lenses to focus the image that's coming in through the front of the eye on the retina. In the case of a person with albinism, there are those different changes in the eye that can get some correction from eyeglasses or contact lenses, but the real problem is at the back of the eye. So the fovea is like the center. It's of the eye at the back of the eye, where the receptors are concentrated, and the front of the eye focuses the image on that point. And because of this lack of pigment, as you can see in the upper left, you can see it's a very dark image. For a person with albinism, the image on the lower right, because there is no pigment, you can see the light is just shining back out from the eye. And this slide points out that fovea is underdeveloped. And what that means, kind of in more simplistic terms, is that the retina of a person who has albinism has fewer pixels. There are fewer rods and cones, or they don't work quite correctly. And the result of that is that if you think about the fact that pictures are made up essentially of dots, we have fewer dots. So if you look at this next, you can see if you increase the number of dots, you take something that really doesn't look like much of anything on the left, and you can see that it's a woman, I believe, on her phone on the right. So to kind of summarize what that visual problem with people with albinism is that we like to say that people with typical vision are watching HD TV. They have more sharp vision. And people with albinism are seeing the world on an old CRT type television, and that I think explains that. So before we move on to the myths and misconceptions and the issues of stigma with albinism, I'll just take a second if there are any questions at all about this part of it. And if not, I can move on. So however you all want to do that.
This is Judge Levy. I have a question for you. Are there any treatments for pills for retina problems and eye problems?
I'm sorry, Judge. You didn't. I didn't hear the whole question.
Are there any medical treatments whatsoever from ophthalmological surgeons?
No, not at this time. So that's why when I said it's an uncorrectable low vision, because there are no effective treatments at this time. Any other questions? So I count to 6 or 10? I can always come back and answer questions later on this. So the other issue that we talked about is stigma, the myths and misconceptions about people with albinism. So there are many myths and misconceptions about people with albinism. I have a story about several years ago. My mother told me that an old neighbor had moved away long before this conversation, knocked on the door to say hello and to see how everybody in the family was doing. And this former neighbor asked my mom, well, is Mike still around? And she said, well, why would you ask a question like that? And she said, oh, well, and this man said, well, I hear that people with albinism die young. And so there are ideas that people with albinism have reduced intellectual capabilities. There are ideas that people with albinism are somehow supernatural. These are very weird myths that are perpetuated by misrepresentation in art and literature and in movies. If you think about it, if the incidence of albinism is so low, it's very likely that someone throughout their life may never encounter a person with albinism. So if you see the depiction of a person with albinism in some crazy movie, you might, not very intelligently, but associate that, well, that's the way that people with albinism are. There's a dermatologist in the San Francisco Bay Area by the name of Vale Reese, who has a passion for movies, and he has a website called Stigma. And he did a study back in the late 1990s and early 2000s about the negative portrayals of people with albinism in movies. And he found at that time something like 67 representations of people with albinism that were universally negative. They were unsympathetic, supernatural, unrealistic, evil characters. In about 2005, a movie by the name of The Da Vinci Code came out, and the organization that I was working with at the time, NOAA, did a public awareness campaign to try to bust some of those myths and misconceptions. And I'm not saying that we were the total cause of it, but the number of negative depictions of people with albinism in movies has dramatically reduced in the last 15 years or so. So one of the things that people with albinism deal with, because of, in the case of people that have the greatly reduced pigmentation in their skin, hair, and eyes, they look different. So I think it makes sense, and I think you all are probably just as familiar with this concept as I am, but I use this slide to really define stigma is the possession of a belief. Stigma is the possession of or belief that one possesses, that some attribute or characteristic that conveys a social identity is somehow undervalued. And I experienced that as much more when I was younger, because having white hair when you're in kindergarten, you stand out. I don't know what possesses people, but this is almost a universal experience of people with albinism. You'll be going down the street and somebody will be compelled to yell, "Hey, albino." I don't know what that's all about, but that stigma is something that people with albinism live with. Now, the stigmatization based on difference can vary in different parts of the world, and can vary in cultures, and it can vary in different racial and ethnic groups. So the most extreme manifestations of stigma occur, unfortunately, in a number of countries in Africa, where the beliefs, the traditional beliefs in witchcraft lead to harmful practices because the witch doctors profess this idea that the body parts or the blood or hair of people with albinism can bring magical powers, particularly wealth and success in business. And unfortunately, this has led to hundreds of attacks, mutilations, some murders, a number of murders, grave desecration, and all sorts of human rights, extreme human rights violations. And this particular quote that I have up here is taken from the African Albinism Network's website. This particular issue became widely known around 2007 or 2008, when a very courageous BBC reporter in Tanzania brought these ritualistic practices to light. And it really has, that work that this woman by the name of Vicky Natema did really started a movement that has grown legs and has done a lot. And I'll talk a little bit about that now. Just to back up one little bit, in terms of the United States, there has been significant legislation that helps deal with people with disabilities and people that look different. I should have said this earlier, but the low visual acuity associated with albinism can be described as legally blind, and that places people with albinism not only looking physically very different for their racial or ethnic group, but they're also in the disabilities category. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1974 mandates that students with disabilities be given accommodations for equal access to the education environment. And the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990, brings the idea of reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities, throughout public accommodation and in the workplace. Going back to the issues that came up in Africa in 2007 or so, the United States House of Representatives passed a resolution condemning that back in 2010. And coincidentally, the congressman that sponsored that resolution was the congressman from Virginia whose staff was attacked by two of his staff members were attacked yesterday. It's kind of a weird connection there. International Albinism Awareness Day was declared in 2014 by the United Nations General Assembly, and the United Nations appointed a special expert for the enjoyment of human rights of people with albinism in 2015. The European Union passed a resolution condemning the attacks in 2017. And as a result of a lot of momentum built up by these things, I'm going to tell you now about the emergence of the Global Albinism Alliance. So the Global Albinism Alliance is essentially a nascent organization. We're not really totally fully off the ground yet, but we're very close, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about our story. As I said a minute ago, the United Nations appointed a special expert for the enjoyment of human rights by people with albinism, and that person's first mandate started in 2015, and her name was Ikpanwosa Iro, also known as IK. IK was born and grew up in Nigeria. She has albinism, and because of political difficulties, her family ended up emigrating to Canada. IK went on to be a lawyer and is a human rights advocate of great talent. So in about 2019, IK approached me and a gentleman by the name of Antoine Glixon, who was a person with albinism involved with the French Albinism Association called Genespois. And IK asked Antoine and I to help her plan an exploratory meeting to form a global albinism alliance. And that exploratory meeting took place in France in January of 2020. The timing was impeccable. We got together and created this great momentum, and a month later, the whole world shut down. 27 delegates from around the world representing all 6 continents, and I forget exactly how many countries, gathered for 2.5 days. And our goal was to examine and discuss the value of creating this formal albinism alliance. Now, there had been 2 previous attempts to do so, but we reached, I think, a critical mass in Paris in 2020. And here is a group picture of all the folks that were participated in that. This, unlike my kindergarten picture that my wife once said to me, oh, let me pick you out, let me pick you out. And I said, well, that's going to be really easy because I was the only one with white hair. A little bit harder to pick me out in this one because we had a lot of white hair. Anyway, what this group decided to do was to do a pilot phase, to do a global consultation, to study the key aspects of a future alliance, update the database of albinism groups, and to gain experience operating as an alliance. So in 20 and 21, we did that. Our big accomplishment was a worldwide survey of those organizations. Our database now has over 250 organizations. At the time that we did the worldwide survey in 2020, 146 responses were received, and we got a good picture of what the landscape of albinism organizations was, and we got a deeper understanding of their challenges, and we learned what they would expect to see from an alliance. I apologize for this, the different slides having different formats. I must admit that I cobbled this together from different places, so forgive me for not being totally consistent. So during this assessment phase, after we did the pilot part, we entered into an assessment phase where our goals were to look at the pilot phase and figure out what we learned, do additional consultations, define our mission and vision, start a strategic plan, study GAA membership and structure, and build infrastructure and do some fundraising. So we did some additional consultations with regional organizations because we found in our survey that most of the organizations were national albinism groups. We exchanged with international NGOs that are serving people with albinism, and we consulted with other international alliances to learn how to best bring people together. And we had continued multiple exchanges with the UN independent expert on albinism. At the end of 2021, this group here gathered in London for a strategic focus group. From left to right is Harry Freeland, who runs an organization called Standing Voice. They deliver direct services to people with albinism in Tanzania and Malawi. The next person is Antoine, who I mentioned. The lady standing in the middle is Carol Prendergast. She is on our core team. The current UN independent expert for albinism is Maluka Mitian Drummond. She is the 4th person from the left, and then the guy on the big fat guy on the right is me. So anyway, we have been able to build the GAA infrastructure by putting up a Facebook page, a website, email address. We've issued some newsletters. We got a fiscal agent while we are working on getting our tax-exempt status in the United States, and we have done some fundraising. So the launch of the Global Albinism Alliance is ongoing. We are registered as a nonprofit in Delaware, but this is incorrect here, that we do not have the 501c3 status yet. We made our application in late August of last year, and we haven't heard. We anticipate that we'll have a membership of about 150 organizations. There'll be an elected board. We are fortunate enough to have raised some money where Antoine is acting as our executive director, and we have a commitment for him to his salary to be covered for 5 years while we incubate the organization. When we are going to be able, hopefully, to add staff before too long, will be a multicultural and multilingual organization, and we'll continue to work closely with the UN mandate. And we anticipate that we'll have all of this up and running by the first quarter of next year. So I'm getting towards the end here. I wanted to talk about, to tie this to Massé World, I wanted just to go over what our vision is. The GAA vision is a world where persons with albinism have the best possible quality of life. Now, that's kind of general, but given the problems and the issues that I've expressed to you, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to overcome that stigma of difference and dealing with the disability and, of course, the horrific problems that our people in Africa face. What our mission is to help albinism organizations around the world be stronger and more impactful. We see the Global Albinism Alliance as an alliance of organizations, not necessarily individual. The GAA will exist also to improve knowledge about albinism, both in the social sciences as well as life sciences. And we see our role is to advocate at the global level to improve the lives of people affected by albinism. So specifically to that point, I have extracted from our strategic plan, because this, I think, is what you all are interested in, is advocacy. I've extracted our 2023 short-term goals. So by the end of 2023, the GAA will have built a strategy to influence public policies and impact people internationally. Now, we see that we want to do that by building partnerships and collaborations, not only with albinism groups, but with disabilities groups, with blindness groups, with women's, any connection that we can find that will help advance the human rights of people with albinism. We intend to do that. Now, by the end of 2023, the GAA will start putting together an application to get the ECOSOC status. I don't really know exactly what the acronym is, but suffice it to say, maybe some of you understand this better than I do, but the ECOSOC status is, it gives a nonprofit or an NGO the ability to interact with the United Nations, particularly in the area of human rights. And hopefully by June of 2023, we will have received the addition of sunscreen for persons with albinism to the World Health Organization's essential medicines list. We made an application in December for that. And I think that if we're successful there, that's an example of some substantial advocacy that will help us in helping organizations get their governments to recognize that sunscreen is not just a cosmetic. It is essential for people with albinism to protect them from the harmful rays of the sun. While I talked about the horrific practices in Africa, what's really killing people with albinism in Africa is the fact that they don't have adequate sun protection. And what we hope to be one of our flagship programs, or what we hope to be a flagship program, is to bring together a wide range of stakeholders to build a program to grow and scale and spread out those successful programs like Harry Freeland has done with Standing Voice in Tanzania, and spread that not only throughout Africa, but to other parts of the global South. So Raisa asked me to also talk a little bit about how Massé World and the GAA could work together and collaborate. I would hope that once we're up and running, that you all would become a member as an organization. And we are open to any collaborations in terms of advocacy in North America or in the United States or around the world. So I am open to any questions and any discussion that you all would like.